Professor Rogowsky, who's actually online right now. He's sitting quietly waiting for us, and we really thank you. Although it's virtually, since you couldn't be with us in person today, COVID has affected so many people, and this is one of the reasons. But we're also delighted that the advantage of technology has permitted us to do this. Special thank you to David Kahn, who has seen to it that we continue to have access, and he's our man. This is a return for you, Professor Rogowsky. We understand that you were here in 2016, and even as a speaker, and even though I did not attend and I was not here then, I've heard really great things about that experience, and we're looking forward to doing it again today. Although the main focus of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the tragic human toll and destruction, we still wanted to do a program in a timely manner on the economic impact of the Ukraine invasion, and are grateful to Dr. Rogowsky to discuss subjects which is well known for his expertise in international trade. Gentleman is a professor in the International Trade Program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. He also teaches as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and McCourt School of Public Policy. In addition, he is president of the Institute for Trade and Commercial Diplomacy, and he spent nearly 2 decades at the U.S. International Trade Commission, where he served as chief economist from 1995 to 1999, and as director of operations from 1991 to 2010. He has testified on many occasions for Congress on matters involving international trade, and has published widely on the topics of international trade, competition policy, and regulation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and say that we are good to go, knowing that at the end of your comments, we are going to have our regular question and answer opportunity, and Doug Rogers will be coming around with the microphone so that you can ask questions staying at your seat, and Dr. Rogowsky will be here to answer them. Just to know that he will be holding on to the microphone and will not let it go. This is in line with fewer germs are better. And but he will be standing there right with you while you are asking the question. Okay, thank you all, and let's go.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's a great honor to be asked to participate. I remember the time I was at the council a few years ago, and it was really an exciting conversation. I'm thrilled to be back, with apologies for being online because, well, I'm in Virginia, so that's where I teach for Middlebury and for Georgetown in the fall. But it's a great topic, and I really appreciate being here. I have shared my screen. Is it visible?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Good. We're going to kind of walk through this, and I apologize in that I have a lot of numbers, but the numbers are just sort of suggestive, and there's a whole bunch of topics to talk about. I'll walk through them, grind out a few numbers, show some of the really difficult things going on, and maybe even some silver linings in all of this, if we can find some of those. So that's sort of my plan. And I always tend to start these out with my grandson because I want to make sure that as much as I enjoy hearing myself speak, that if questions come up, someone has something that they want to ask, or an informational question as I go, please feel free to talk to Dave and put the questions out there. I want to start out with this. This really is talking about the world that we live in, and to understand what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, at least from the economic point of view, it's good to remind ourselves what the world looks like today. And I want to highlight that because I want to point out the incredible integration that the world has experienced over the last century, and in particular, the last 50 years. So trade has grown dramatically, GDP has grown dramatically, foreign direct investment has grown dramatically, international transactions have grown dramatically, $7 trillion of transactions across borders every day. 700,000 overseas affiliates are in place, and the amount of production and sales from overseas affiliates of foreign firms is greater than the trade that takes place, which is itself is quite large. Not quite large, it's extremely large. So there's this amazing integration that's taking place. And that's relevant to our story because the way we react to the Russia-Ukraine invasion is because of that incredible integration of the economy. And then another really important point that I just find fascinating is the growth of the world economy. So in 2011 dollars, so putting all the dollars into the same value, in 1700, there was $643 billion worth of production in the world. 1950, it had grown to $9.25 trillion. By 2001, it was 64 trillion, and by 2015, it was over $108 trillion. So you can see in the graph the amazing growth in wealth produced in the world. And that mostly is because of the ability to integrate the marketplace and take advantage of the resources around the world in a way that improves production and makes things available for people around the world. So it is from the time when I was born to now, the world has gone from 9 trillion to $108 trillion in production and integration. So the setting that in place to think about the Ukraine thing, first of all, the international trading system was dramatically affected by the financial crisis of 2008. Trade dropped, investment dropped, wealth dropped. And so there was a tremendous breakdown in the system and the beginning of concerns by many countries that they did not want to be victimized by these international financial crises and began protecting themselves in a form of reduction of trade and building barriers. So a form of protectionism began even in 2008. And then in 2018, we have the US-China trade war, which is still going on in the sense that President Biden has not undone all the things that President Trump has done. He has taken those protections and the tariffs and the penalties that President Trump put on and retains many of them or is negotiating them away. So the war for many of our trading partners is not really felt to be over. This is particularly true with China. Then, of course, COVID hits 2020, and it just forced sectors of all across the economy and all across the world, locking down sectors, disrupting global supply chains, and producing what seems to be a persistent reduction in labor supply, especially in the United States, the Great Resignation that you're all familiar with. And this is a fundamental change because businesses now can't get back up to speed because they can't find the workers to do the work that they want. Then China engages in its draconian COVID-19 lockdowns, literally locking down huge portions of its economy, which not just affects Chinese workers and Chinese consumers and Chinese producers, but China is a linchpin in many of the global supply chains that are critical for goods being developed, being processed and assembled and produced and sent to wherever the customers are. So whatever happens in China really doesn't stay in China. It affects the whole world. And then on top of that, we have this massive environmental turmoil across the planet. And if you pay any attention to the weather or the news, you can see it throughout the United States. Droughts, flooding, heat waves, firestorms, all kinds of problems in the United States, in Europe, in China, and in Africa, and even in Latin America. So it's this major environmental turmoil across the globe that is dramatically affecting food and energy and transportation and supply chains. And if you spend any time in the grocery store, you get a sense of exactly how dramatic it would be, especially for countries that aren't as well-to-do as we are. On top of that, you have this growing, what economists are calling secular stagnation, a sudden shifting to high inflation and stagnation potential that could lead to the kind of stagflation that we had in the 1970s and early 80s. And this is a shocking change because for 20 years, well, almost 20 years, the government was trying to get inflation up to 2%. And then all of a sudden, literally in a few months, it went from about 1.5% up to 9%. And so now we've got this high inflation energy in the economy, and economists don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to control it. And the idea of controlling it without stagnating the economy is an art that I don't think our policymakers are adept at. They don't seem to know how to do this. And then on top of that, Russia invades Ukraine, which is driving up the price of all manner of things, and critical things, not just the price of those goods, but things that will affect prices all along the supply chain. So you have this series of events that have led to a crisis in the world, one of which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is just a simple picture of where economies are growing. And I do want to point out that the United States is growing nice and strongly here. And China is falling in its growth rate down to somewhere between 5 and 9.9%. But the latest growth levels I saw for China were more like 3.5% as a result of some of the things that I have just mentioned that affect China's ability to produce. The problem with China declining is that their political stability is based on economic growth, and their economic growth is the driver of many other economies who sell most of their exports to China. So a drop in growth in China is going to be felt around the world. A silver lining here is part of the reason we have lower gas prices is because the demand in China has decreased. And the fall of demand in China, which will hurt many economies that sell to China, will also tend to temper the inflation that we have because they'll be selling goods elsewhere, not demanding energy as much. And so there's going to be possibly some silver lining in China's decline. But having said that, a decline in growth of a very, very large economy like that is going to have bottom line is going to be very difficult for the world economy. They just are that important in the process. So just thinking about some of the commerce problems, jumped ahead, that are arising because of this. Of the 281 Fortune 500 companies that were present in China, about 70% have scaled back or exited China completely. 85% of the companies headquartered in Europe or the US have left or scaled back, and only 40% of those based in other regions. The exodus is not confined to one sector. This is companies all across the economy are leaving Russia. That also creates I mean, it's a good political move, and I think it's something important as a statement to make that we don't accept this kind of invasion. But these are extremely expensive operations for companies to make. There is a great deal of cost to this, both in terms of just expensive closing down offices, but then finding new places for people to work, new supply chains, new outlets for customers. A lot of the profits of business will be shifted now into this emergency response mode that they're getting into, just to be able to cope with the substantial change that they've been willing to make by leaving a large customer base. And of course, in many places, Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports has been dubbed a war crime. And in many ways, that's because this is so important to so many critical factors coming out of Ukraine and Russia, which I'll get to in a minute. We've heard a lot about the energy markets, so let me just chat and think about those a little bit. With the sanctions that are imposed on Russia, that dramatically affects the energy markets, of course. Russia is the third largest oil producer. It's the world's second largest natural gas producer, and it is one of the top 5 producers of steel, nickel, and aluminum. So these, when you cannot now produce or purchase from a major supplier, the whole market gets disrupted. Not just prices go up, but huge amounts of energy from corporations have to be taken out of productive capacity and put into finding ways to realign supply chains, sources, and customer base. So again, a very great cost for businesses for this to happen. A little complicated because India, of course, has been balancing on the fence about this because they want to take advantage of as much oil as they can. So they're buying a lot of Russian oil. They're dealing a lot with the Chinese, buying and selling with the Chinese, even though they're technically at war with China over certain territories that on the border between the two countries. But business is business, and India has taken a very business-like approach to this. And they have now set up or building a rupee ruble trading mechanism, which is intended to bypass the dollar. As you may know, 88% of all transactions in the globe, international transactions, are conducted in the dollar. And if the dollar is not available to be gotten, to be used to buy China or Russian goods, and because of the sanctions, and the banking system is avoiding any connection with the Russian banks, they have to set up their own system. So India is now working closely with Russia to develop a rupee ruble trading system. So this has now created complications for US-India relations that will be hard to undo and hard to overcome as we go in the next few years. I do want to highlight some of a silver lining, if you will. And this is Russia's attempts to cut off certain, or to punish countries in Europe by cutting off its oil. But these countries are showing tremendous creativity in looking for alternatives and setting up new alliances that will allow them to avoid buying Russia or being dependent on Russian oil. And so Serbia, for example, has been shut off by Russia. So they are now building a line to Romania, and they've organized a line from Azerbaijan that is going to go through Turkey. Different countries are getting now really creative in ways to find new oil, share natural gas, as they develop responses to this energy diplomacy that Russia has been using for a long time, but now is, of course, at a much higher stage than it had been for a very long time. Energy prices are one thing. They've gotten really high. We're starting to see them come down a little bit, again, for those two reasons: a lot of creativity, people finding alternatives. And as China slows down, they're buying less fuel, so more is now becoming available. And to be honest with you, even India can only buy so much. How much storage do you have for fuel? You fill that up, you can't buy very much more. So Russia is now facing more pressures because that availability of oil is now creatively being shifted to countries that it heretofore were able to blackmail with its oil supply. But at the same time, we've got a bit of more pressing crisis, and that is the food crisis that is coming as a result of this, because in many ways, Ukraine has been considered the breadbasket of Europe. Between Ukraine and Russia, they are major suppliers of things like wheat, 30% of the global wheat exports, wheat and barley, 65% of sunflower seed and sunflower seed oil, and 15% of corn. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter. And you can see the numbers here. Ukraine is a key exporter of corn. It's the 6th largest, 7th largest in wheat, largest in sunflowers, and is among the top 10 producers of sugar beets, barley, soy, and rapeseed, all of which are important foods for producing more foods, and also especially for poorer countries. 25 African countries, including most least developed countries, import more than half or 1/3 of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. For 15 of them in sub-Saharan Africa, it's more than half of their wheat comes from there. And so when the war occurred at a time when already supplies were tight, this put an incredible pressure on these developing countries. And as I mentioned before, on this, there are droughts going on, massive heat waves, and in the midst of this, huge flooding in various parts of Africa, Eurasia, and of course in the United States, where we grow a great deal of wheat, corn, barley, and soy. So we're all suffering from it as well. Everyone's suffering, and now the one place where it should be coming from, and people have been relying on, is at war. And the Russians in particular are blocking a lot of the wheat from coming out, or any of these foods from coming out of the Ukraine. And I was listening to the news today as I was coming back from Georgetown, saying that the one boat that's come out, the first boat that's come out with some Ukrainian wheat, will hit Ethiopia today. And the nation is desperately waiting for it, because as UNCTAD points out, in many of these countries, more than 5% of the poorest countries, the import basket is composed of the products that are likely to face a price hike during this war. So those countries that are desperately needing this food, huge amounts of their income are going to buy this. And when the prices rise, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, well, literally millions of people will be pushed into poverty, from outside the poverty level and pushed down into it, hurting them much more than the rich countries. Yes, we have to pay higher prices, but we don't really face shortages or dramatic impositions on our budgets. McKinsey has calculated the food prices might rise by as much as 45%, which pushes millions of people in low and middle income countries into poverty, as I mentioned before. And so this is going to have a dramatic impact on these nations, on top of the problems that they're facing with the environmental pressures that they've been having. In addition, when this happens, when you have this shortage of food in place and high inflation, and especially energy inflation, which filters through so many different products and is such a dominant part of the budget of so many people in lower income countries, this has led those countries to themselves turn to food protection. So according to the very prominent think tank, the International Food Policy Research Institute, COVID had already created transportation problems and shortages that led to protection of foods, which meant protection means we're not going to let food in or out of our country. And now the Ukraine crisis, on top of the environmental crisis, has forced other countries to do the same. And so you can see that the the price of food has been going up dramatically. It's tapered and now coming down a little bit, but in part, that is a temporary reduction because there's the anticipation that we're going to see a lot more shortages in the next growing cycle. I mentioned the export protectionism that is blocking food from coming in and going out. Indonesia is one example. It's the latest country to announce an export ban, stopping overseas sales of palm oil. Palm oil is an important vegetable oil used across the world, along with sunflower oil, sunflower seed oil that the Ukrainians are banning, or that have now can't get out. There's going to be a tremendous shortage of vegetable oil available. And just last Monday, this past Monday, yesterday, India banned export of wheat. So again, another loss of supply of wheat for the world. And we're going to see these prices start to rise dramatically as the demand continues to rise and that supply gets further constricted. The future is also looking problematic because Ukraine and Russia produce roughly a third of the world's ammonia and potassium. And these are essential ingredients for fertilizer. So if the price of, if the supply of ammonia and potassium goes down so that it's very hard to get and the price goes up dramatically, rationing it to the countries that actually can afford to pay it and not to those countries that can't afford to compete at those prices, then food commodity prices are going to go up dramatically because the next harvest season, next year's harvest won't be as robust as it could be or should be. Even assuming that the weather conditions that we have this year don't persist to next year. If they persist to next year, it's going to be even worse. So there is the possibility of massive food shortages across the world in important staple foods. UN estimates that 30 to 4% of the autumn harvest in Ukraine is at risk. That's a huge amount given the importance of Ukraine as a European breadbasket and supplying huge parts of the world. So Russia doesn't export a lot to the world. It's not a heavily engaged economy in the world except for oil and weapons, but it does produce a few important base metals, fats and cereals that I mentioned, and wood products, among other things. So in a few sectors, it's going to be substantial increases because now we have decided not to buy anything from Russia. And of course, coal, steel, and nickel, which I mentioned before, which are critical for many production processes and products that come out of manufacturing. Automakers in particular will be impacted by aluminum, copper, and steel prices. And of course, many industries will be affected by the anthracite or the coal, the ban on buying coal from Russia as well. So across the board, some very critical industries that come from the minerals and metals that have been coming out of Russia, even though they're not a huge portion of the global economy as a whole, they have a few critical products in place. Export to Russia have declined by 60%. You're familiar with the sanctions that are in place, the many sanctions that are in place, all of which are intended to keep goods from going into Russia, keep goods from coming out of Russia, to isolate Russia in place. And even though China has maintained a deep friendship with Russia, unlimited friendship, I think is the word they had for it, Chinese exports to Russia have fallen dramatically, over 38% in the second half of this last year. And in part, this is because Russia can't produce anything and it's going through its own economic disruption, but mostly it's because most of the exports from China are exported by multinational corporations who are closely tied to Europe and the United States, and they have to follow the sanction rules of the United States and Europe. And so China is now victim to the fact that it has so vastly incorporated multinational corporations from the West into its economy, and is going to have to live by their rules, since they have to live by Washington and Brussels rules. And a number of Chinese large banks have stopped working with Russian banks, because if they work with Russian banks, then they can't work with American banks, because the sanctions keep the Chinese, any banks that are working with Russian banks, from working with the American banks. And even the Chinese, as big as they are, cannot avoid working with the American and European financial system. So the great strength that we have in our sanctions is the power of our financial system to allow economics to take place in an integrated marketplace. And even Huawei, which has been blacklisted by the United States, has decided not to work with China, because to the extent it does work with countries around the world, not China or Russia, it does need to use the American financial system. So the sanctions have been really quite effective in getting what they want, part of what they want done. That is punishing Russia. Whether it changes Putin's policy or not is yet to be seen, but at least they're doing what they can do in terms of imposing the pain that we think sanctions should be imposing. And finally, let me just wrap this up with a little discussion of the refugee problem. When you've heard about a lot of the refugees that have been taking place, about 6 million have fled Ukraine, nearly 8 million inside Ukraine are displaced, being shoved out by war zones and moved into other places in Ukraine. Nearly 30% of Ukrainians have been pushed out of their homes. And UN estimates about 8.3 million Ukrainians could be refugees by the end of the year, depending on how the war goes, although it's now hit into a stalemate. And so we've hit a bit of a stability point in terms of the dislocation of people. And of course, these millions of Ukrainians are now jumping on top of the almost 90 million people that have been forcibly displaced from their homes in 2021 across the globe. And so you have vast numbers of people being displaced. And on top of that, now Ukrainians are trying to fit in and also get serviced as they deal with this war that's pushing them out of their homes. And just to point out that there are more than 280 million migrants. 3.6% of the world's population are in some form of migrating, either as refugees, internally displaced, or asylum seekers. And so there's this tremendous disruption in the world as well that civil society and governments are trying to handle. So that's the end of my formal remarks. And I am perfectly happy to take questions or comments or advice, because frankly, you all have probably keeping up on this as well as I am, because it's in the news and I can't seem to stop looking at it, because it just seems like such an important event going on in the world that is affecting the entire world. Even though it's just one country against another in one part of Europe, it really has affected the entire world, in large part because we have, over the last 70 years, become so economically integrated as one global marketplace. So let me stop and see if there's any questions that we can use to raise discussion.
Thank you so much for articulating all of the issues, somber as they may be, and we're hoping that they are the dolphins there and no one else. So with that, Peter?
Is this on? So you do paint a bleak picture, as Judith said, and very well, I might say. Do you have any idea of what, if any, actions are being taken to address this rather cataclysmic situation that we face? That, you know, things that could take place, or maybe something that is being done now to try to stave off some of the impact on third world countries and others who are going to be in such a disadvantaged position from this.
Well, yes, a great deal's being done, as you might guess. Everybody is trying to figure out how to address this. But when I say this, I want to emphasize that there's a lot of this in the world that people are trying to address. So if you look at what farmers in the United States are doing, if it's at all possible to improve your wheat harvest or your corn harvest or your soy harvest, you're doing everything you can. And fortunately, you Canadians have actually had a pretty good harvest. So they're going to do well this year. And of course, increase their sales to the global marketplace. But in the United States, as you know, we have this drought going on. So our crops are I don't know the exact percentage, but the crops are at a relatively small percentage of what they should be and normally would be. And even, I was listening this morning, in New England, there's a drought in New England, and fruits and vegetables that they grow extensively are not growing, and they're just not even trying to grow them or harvest them. And a lot of harvest in the United States. That's just the United States. Africa is the same way. So organizations, the UN, the Food Research Institute, the World Health Organization, USDA, everyone is trying to provide opportunities for people to figure out some way to get around this or to allocate food. But it is an almost chaotic situation, since it was so, I'm going to say, sudden, in the sense that we really hadn't anticipated this horrible drought year, this environmental turmoil to come this year. And we're still responding to shortages that are rising because of COVID. And now a inflation that has come besides the Russian-Ukrainian war. And so there's all of these problems that are in place, and people are in many ways flummoxed, if I can use that word, as to what to do. How do you do this? Because what you need is to grow food. And it's not even that you can ask people to work overtime or double duty or subsidize production. You can't. It just can't be grown. And that's why we're having such problems. And I don't know. I know a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do, but I don't think we have any really good solutions for this.
This kind of piggybacks on the last question, but let me throw an argument that I've heard and get your reflection on it. And that is talking about the international banking system. The criticism is that our sanctions have created as much or more misery internationally as has been created by the war in Ukraine. Do you feel, what's your calculus of, are these sanctions perhaps doing more harm than good?
Yeah, this is a prominent debate, as you might guess, because the truth about sanctions is they always work and they never work, with the possible exception of the sanctions applied to apartheid in South Africa and Rhodesia. Other than that, they always work and they don't work. And what I mean by always work is that sanctions are intended to inflict pain that will change public policy. And the sanctions always inflict pain, and they hardly ever change public policy. So the idea is, can we make people suffer enough that Putin will finally feel so bad that he'll stop invading in Ukraine. And that's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So we're left with this dilemma. We have sanctions, which we put in place with the idea of expressing our dismay or our rejection of these policies, but they have to be applied to someone, and inevitably they are applied in ways that hurt lots of people. And even though we try to target certain oligarchs and generals and their daughters and sons that are trying to go to American colleges, we can target those a little bit. But the real sanctions ultimately will slow down economic activity in a way that hurts a lot of people. And it's a great moral question. Do you not do the sanctions and just let Putin make all the money he needs and run his economy and just make loud, boisterous statements about how much we hate what he's doing, but we're going to keep working with him? Or do we do something that really tries to punish the Russians enough that they get rid of that government and put in place a government that is going to be much more amenable to the way we all want to live? And I go back and forth about this. Most thoughtful people go back and forth because we see the advantage, the benefit, almost a moral imperative, but also the incredible pain that it places. So I wander around about this, and I don't have the right answer. I tend to think that some form of sanctions are necessary because you must do something to express that this behavior is unacceptable, and to inflict punishment if you can, but to do it as narrowly and carefully as you can. And we don't seem to have that down, especially when we do hundreds of different sanctions and close them out from the trading system, because it really can be a tremendously painful experience.
What do you see happening on natural gas supply for Europe this winter?
I see them having extremely high prices, a lot of chilly nights, and a lot of energy a lot of effort going into building the facilities they need for liquid natural gas to be pumped, to be exported to Europe. They just don't have the capacity for that. And like in the case of Serbia and Albania and Macedonia, they're making connections to other places where they can get oil, get fuel, because of the necessity. And what surprised me about that was that they're anticipating getting these new pipelines in by 2023 or 2024. I mean, these are big projects. But if you're desperate to get them, and you don't have time for all the bureaucracy that goes into a lot of construction projects, you can get things built. And I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of creative building going on that's going to allow Europe to really step away from Russian dependence on Russia. But it's going to be a very cold winter doing it. But I do think the United States will step up and send as much as we possibly can. And then it may not, it's going to be a cold winter. I don't think it's going to be as bad as many people think it is. And unfortunately, I think I heard today that the Germans have decided to go ahead and shut down their nuclear plants. I thought they had decided to keep them going, but I heard they had decided to take them down, which I think is a gross mistake. They should keep those things running. Frankly, they should build more of them, in my view.
Hello there. I thought I heard you say at the beginning of your talk that you were going to give us a few pearls of hope. Could you maybe do that now, sir?
Yeah. Yeah, my pearls of hope are embedded in my belief that creative people in need will show the creativity to come up with reasonable solutions. And I think in the Balkans, they're doing that. They're working together. They're coming to the realization that they can't rely on Russia, that the Russians' energy diplomacy has been a very oppressive thing for almost every country that finds itself under that thumb. So they're moving out of that thumb. And what was really a silver lining for me was the fact that they have projections of being able to do that by 2023, 2024. So maybe a cold winter, but only one cold winter. And so I think that that's a reasonably good, for me, that was a silver lining. I think the other one is that I think a lot of countries are, I think that a lot of countries realizing that their economic tie to China is a binding tie that they really should think more carefully about. And as China's declines, as China's growth level slows down and it turns internally, I think a lot of countries that have become very dependent on China are going to be looking for more broad strategic trade policies, getting themselves back into what I will call the Western world. And so I think that that's ultimately going to be a good thing for one, those countries, and two, when the United States sits down with China with some very serious trade negotiations, it's going to add to our leverage. So, and I think us having more leverage in that is always a good thing, because we represent the democracies and the rule-based trading system that has grown up under the Bretton Woods system since 1947. And China is the other guys. They're the group that is really looking to reestablish more authoritarian systems in place. And so I think that that shift is also going to be a silver lining. Nothing quick. This is going to take time. But I do think it's going to, I hope, it's going to be a better trading system in the next half decade.
Sort of gave us a little bit of hope there. And you've been very generous in your time. If we could take 3 more questions, because I noticed we have a new member who has a hand up, a board member, and Phil. So,
what is the forecast on the supply chain?
On the supply chains?
Yes.
It's a great question, and it's a little bit hard to answer because there's a lot of movement, and that movement seems to be a tendency by multinational corporations, particularly Western, US and European, Canadian, Australian, and Japanese companies, to what we call friendshore. Instead of offshoring, friendshoring. And that is coming back to countries where they have more trust in the governing system of the countries, basically coming back to more democratic countries. And so we're now seeing an effort to do that. This began under Donald Trump, trying to encourage manufacturing to come back into the United States. Every president has tried to do this. Biden is trying to do it, and we're seeing a surprising amount of large multinational companies with serious goods, semiconductor chips, auto parts, coming back into the United States, putting major investments back in the United States, billions of dollars worth of investment. Part of the problem is that you can make a plan to do that $1.5 billion investment in Texas, and then it turns out it's really hard to do that because the environmental restrictions and all the zoning restrictions. And then, frankly, the problem is companies are trying to build facilities and they can't get workers in the United States. We literally have a severe shortage of skilled labor in the United States. And so it's one thing to build a gigantic factory so that you can build chips and advanced macro devices in the US, but if you don't have people to build them, it's a problem. And so I think that's what we're seeing with supply chains, is a real strategic rethinking into tighter, shorter supply chains within reliable trading partners. Whether that's a good thing or not is just there's a lot of cost to that, because there was a reason they were long supply chains around the world, because they were really efficient, cost effective. As long as you could trust the system, it worked really well. And you could see us go from 9 trillion in world GDP to 108 because of those long supply chains. Now we're compressing them down. So we're going to lose some efficiency, but gain some political stability, which also will tend to create regional divides. So the East and West is now going to be more politically divided and definable, and more economically divided and definable. And I'm not sure that's a good thing either.
Alex, do you believe that Russia is waiting for winter? In a recent speech President Putin gave, he described the sanctions as kind of backfiring and giving that way to people in the European countries to be upset with their leadership as they face hardship during the winter, which could then lead to potential new power in those countries. Do you think maybe it's being weaponized, the energy and grain and the commodities by Russia?
Yeah, let me make sure I got that. So the question is, do I see that Russia is going to continue to and more aggressively weaponize its oil capabilities, oil as a source, to be more influential in the European governments? Did I catch that right?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. If at all possible, he will do that. He's absolutely shown every interest and willingness to engage in energy diplomacy, energy blackmail, frankly. He is engaged actively in crypto warfare by taking over electrical systems, digital systems, computer systems. He is actively engaged in social media warfare on elections. I have no doubt about that. He would affect any election and every election that could possibly be beneficial. I mean, he is in many ways an old-fashioned 19th century imperialist with 21st century technologies. And so he's going to behave in a very predictable way, and he's going to weaponize everything he possibly can. And I think that what surprised him, maybe surprised all of us, is that when we saw this happening, how the West organized itself in recognition of the threat, because this is not Albania messing around. This is a serious Cold Warrior taking on 21st century technology with 19th century ambitions. And I know a lot of scholars have said that we forced Putin into this because we expanded NATO. And I just disagree with that. I think he's an old-fashioned imperialist. This is what they do. It's how they operate. It's their modus operandi. And there's really, I think it's very predictable. And I think what took him so long is he's been preparing for this for a decade, with building dependencies on his oil, connecting into international organizations, developing relationships, working on elections in certain places, developing stakeholder relationships in certain critical governments. He's been doing this for a long time, and this has been building up. He just misunderstood the Ukrainians, and he misunderstood the West. And now he's stuck with this. And I don't know what his outcome will be, but it I don't think can go well for Russia. Can't go well for anybody, frankly, because it's already that bad. But he is between a rock and a hard place, I think.
Given what you have said, and particularly in the last comments about Russian behavior, since it's increasingly obvious that, as you started out earlier saying, that the American economists don't know what to do, the Fed doesn't know what to do. The meeting in Jackson Hole was embarrassing. And when I say, what are we going to do to control inflation? All we seem to hear from Mr. Powell is more rate increases, but that's not going to help a whole lot of other people in this country. What I'm getting at is, are the politics of our own paralysis likely to cause a political crisis in this country, which we already have, and it's going to get worse?
Right. Yeah, I'll try not to go down that rabbit hole. And I will say I had a bit of a comeuppance because I was teaching international finance at Middlebury in the spring, and of course this came up, this exact question, and then they were talking about it's the worst inflation in the last 40 years, and sadly enough, I remember living through that last inflation. I was working in Washington at the time, and it was very much the same question we have right now that you've raised. What do we do about this? And the Fed seems unable to come up with a reasonable strategy for doing this. And I remember distinctly in 1981 when Paul Volcker came in, Ronald Reagan was president, he brought Paul Volcker in, and we had this stagflation in the sense that we had inflation of 9, 10, 12%, and unemployment of 7 or 8%. And if you raised interest rates to slow down inflation, you made more unemployment. If you stimulated the economy to get rid of unemployment, you added to inflation. And so what they decided to do in 1981 was Paul Volcker made the decision as head of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Chairman, we're going to pick one. We're going to fight inflation or unemployment. And he decided to fight inflation. And that made unemployment much worse. It sent us into a very steep recession. But he flushed the inflation out of the system, and then they started building back policies that would rebuild employment. And eventually, we got back to a reasonable employment level with reasonable inflation. What they're trying to do now is what Paul Volcker realized he couldn't do, and that is to handle inflation with a soft landing. You just can manage the two together in our intense political environment and make it work by managing both. And it turns out it's very, very hard to do that. But the one advantage that Powell has is that we have very low unemployment. So he can raise the rates to cut back inflation and not have high unemployment because we are already at more than full employment. We can't find workers. But here's the problem. A lot of the inflation is not because too much money's in the system. A lot of the inflation is because there's not enough supply to meet the demand that there is. And what really needs to be done is a lot more effort to handle the supply problems, which we've been talking about and for which I have no answer, because we just have to wait for the weather to get better. We just have to wait for that. We have to wait for a year's worth of turmoil in the harvests because of the fertilizer crisis, as well as the food crisis. And as you may have read recently, the farmers in Texas, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico can't find enough water for their cattle, so they're butchering them. So go out, buy beef now because the price of beef is coming down, but it is going to be very bad because those are cows that can't breed again, and the next year's herds are going to be much smaller, even if the weather gets better. So we're heading into a very tough year with very high food prices for the next year at least, just because this year, even if all the bad things in this year go away and Putin resigns and Russia gets back into the modern world, it's going to take at least a year to come down from this turmoil. And so I agree with you, Powell doesn't have an answer, but I don't either, quite honestly. And I would not be wanting to have his responsibilities these days. That's a tough one.
Well, thank you for your veracity on this.
Thank you for tolerating me for so long.
That I'm sensing that we end this conversation realizing that nature has really is really the card with everything else. But thank you so much. We really hope to welcome you back again because this is a long story, and we hope to see you as part of the solution and helping us with it. So thank you.
It is.